perfect timing for my next guest. I'm looking at the front page above the fold of today's New York Times. Here's the headline: Politics fuels surge in calls for book bans. Elizabeth Harris and Alexandra Alter wrote this. In Wyoming, a county prosecutor's office considered charges against library employees for stocking books like Sex is a Funny Word and This Book is Gay. In Oklahoma, a bill was introduced in the state Senate that would prohibit public school libraries from keeping books on hand that focus on sexuality activity, sexual identity, or gender identity. In Tennessee, the McMinn County Board of Education voted to remove the Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel Mouse from an 8th grade module on the Holocaust because of nudity and curse words. Parents, activists, school board officials, and lawmakers around the country are challenging books at a pace not seen in decades. Perfect fodder for a conversation with Kenneth C. Davis. Mr. Davis is the best-selling author of Don't Know Much About History and other books in the Don't Know Much About series. He also wrote the acclaimed In the Shadow of Liberty and now Strongman. Kenneth Davis, great to have you back. What accounts for this surge from your perspective?
Well, this is not a new story, Michael, first of all, and thank you for having me. We've been banning and burning books in this country for a long time. What's different now is this is part of a much wider effort to change what we teach in schools, how we teach, who teaches it, what words we can say and can't say. So it's really an assault on education that's part of a broader assault on and the division in our country, because this is part of the don't make our kids wear masks to school approach as well. So there's some deep divisions. I would say for the most part, the parents who are challenging a lot of these books, and sometimes it's a challenge as opposed to an outright ban, don't like them because they don't like the ideas. We can say, it has curse words or it has sex, but there's a much broader sense here that these books currently being attacked tend to be written by people of color. There a lot of gay literature, but to assault the book Mouse 2 days before Holocaust Remembrance Day has really brought this, I think, to an explosive head. But it's really about what education should be. Are we teaching kids a bunch of facts, or are we teaching children to become adults who can think for themselves? Ideally, I think that's what education is. By the way, and I'm sure Kenneth Davis knows this, Mouse, the #1 book at Amazon. So, good for him, good for that effort, that has been the public response to it thus far. I'm sure not intended by the critics. Historically speaking, where does this come from? Well, of course, banning books are as old as books. That they burned the Alexandria Library back in the day. Christians didn't want all those pagan writings to be available. So this is an ancient story. During the Reformation and the Anti-Reformation, Luther's books were being burned. The Catholic Church burned books by a guy named Giordano Bruno because he was challenging the church. And then they went one better and they burned him in the public square in Rome. So it's an old story. Voltaire, James Joyce, go down the list of the great writers and thinkers throughout history. They've all been challenged because writers get at the truth. And the powers that be often don't like the truth. And that is one of the reasons why the First Amendment is so important in our country and in our history. And that's why it's so important to protect the right to express oneself, even in schools. And by the way, Michael, briefly, there is a 1982 decision by the Supreme Court that relates to this. Doesn't have the full force of an opinion, but in the 1982 Island Trees versus Pico case, Justice Brennan said that school officials may not exercise their discretion to remove books from a school library based on narrowly partisan or political grounds, because doing so would amount to official suppression of ideas. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about some curse words or a naked woman or maybe even a description of gay sex. We're talking about the suppression of ideas and the ideas that are offensive to a few people.
It seems like the most recent challenges have come from the right, but the Times points out in the story that I referenced, quote, book challenges aren't just coming from the right. Of Mice and Men and To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, have been challenged over the years for how they address race, and both were among the Library Association's 10 most challenged books in 2020. Ideologically speaking, has there historically been more of this that comes from one end of the spectrum or the other?
Absolutely, I would say that's true. It's been far more an attack that comes from people who perhaps Christian fundamentalist attacks on especially things of sex. Back to the mouse point for just a moment. It used to be for publishers that the words banned in Boston was gold. You hoped that Boston would ban your books because then you'd put it on the front cover. You know, Faulkner, Hemingway, God's Little Acre, Strange Fruit, all banned in Boston, all became bestsellers. So yes, the fact that it's doing well is Mouse is doing well is a tribute to people saying, I don't think they're saying we want to read it because it's sexy. They're saying we believe that these books should be free and available. We are going to read them. But I think the most famous case of what you're talking about is really Huckleberry Finn. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has been under fire for a long time, primarily for its use of the so-called N-word. In 1957, it was removed from the Board of Education in New York City. And there's a really interesting response to that written by in the Harvard Crimson, an editorial in which they said that these words are difficult, but that's the point of education. Education is really about teaching us to deal with difficult things, deal with difficult topics, to think and discern for ourselves. And I have always believed that an excellent teacher, and many teachers are really excellent, especially in the history and the English literature. I deal with them all the time. They are devoted to making sure their kids are getting good stuff and treating it properly. The point is that the Crimson made was this is part of education, dealing with things that are difficult. This has absolutely become, though, much more of a right issue as far as I'm concerned. Another very good example is the use of the book Beloved, written by Toni Morrison,
sure. Yep.
Nobel Prize winning author. It became a campaign issue in the governor's race in Virginia. And the Republican candidate who used that book as a kind of cudgel, of course, went on to win. And that's why this is becoming part of a bigger picture of the great partisan divide in our country, not only about books that we think are dirty or scandalous, but how we teach the history of slavery in this country. A book like Beloved is certainly related to that. How we deal with the questions, as I mentioned, of masks and vaccines. These are really sharp dividing lines that are being used as political cudgels instead of being treated properly.
Kenneth, if I were a parent who had, or a school board member who had some level of objection to Mouse by Art Spiegelman or Beloved by Toni Morrison, I think I would just ignore their presence, because all these campaigns seem to do is to refuel interest in the subject matter. People, as you pointed out with your banned in Boston example, people now want to know, oh, what was that all about? It was 1986 that Mouse was published. He didn't win the Pulitzer for it until 1992. We wouldn't be having this conversation. So I wonder if unintentionally a favor is done to these publishers as well as these authors, which doesn't justify what's gone on here by any stretch. But it reminds me of something that I'll mention to you, and I've said this to my audience in the past. A few years ago, there was a free speech case that went from a New Jersey school district all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, where in a breast cancer awareness campaign, kids were wearing bracelets that said, "I love boobies." And a particular school district banned them. And of course, there was the inevitable First Amendment challenge, and it went all the way, to the Supreme Court. I thought if they had been ignored, it would have been like a pet rock It would have been something that was a fad that a couple of days later the kids wouldn't have been wearing, but they all trickled down and soon everybody wanted one. Your thought?
A couple of thoughts quickly. First of all, many times these, like the case in Virginia, become political issues that are great for fundraising and motivating the base. It's not even so much about getting the book out. It's about firing up the anger that's out there. So that's part of it. Yes, many of these books then profit from that. But more to the original point, if most schools have this policy, if a parent objects to a particular book that may be assigned, not in the library, but assigned to their student, most teachers will make an allowance for that and have an agreeable substitute. So that if you don't want your child to read Mouse, you might be able to read Elie Wiesel's Night, for instance. So there are simple solutions that would take into account the sensitivities of some people. But to just come in and blanket decide that no one can have access to this book is the problem. 1943, again, the Supreme Court, famous decision in the flag pledge case, where the Supreme Court ruled that it was not legal to make every child say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Justice Jackson wrote, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion," and he went on from there. That fixed star in our constellation is one of the most profound, I think, ideas that everyone who believes in the Constitution and the protection of individual rights should hold to.
I'm glad that you distinguished between something that's in the library and something that's required reading, because I might have a different take on a particular circumstance if a particular book was required reading that seemed age inappropriate. I'm not making the case that Mouse was, but I think that's important for you to have said. Leave us with something. What is it that Kenneth Davis most wants us to know about the tradition or history, probably a better word, of book banning and burning?
Well, let me just say about that history. In this country, it really started in 1835 in a big way because they were burning anti-slavery pamphlets in South Carolina. Then the president at the time, Andrew Jackson, went on to say that those things should be banned from the mail, clearly not within the realm of the First Amendment. Those books were burned in South Carolina in massive numbers. 2 years later, an abolitionist publisher was killed when they came to burn his books, Elijah Lovejoy. On a lighter note, in 1953, a school board commission in Indiana wanted to ban any books mentioning Robin Hood. Why? Robin Hood stole from the rich and gave to the poor. That's socialism. We can't have children learning socialism. We can laugh at that, but that was part of a much broader banning of that time by Joseph McCarthy, who sent Attorney Roy Cohn to Europe to clear out the libraries of the State Department. And thousands of books were removed from the State Department, to which President Eisenhower, not really willing to take on Joseph McCarthy, told a group at Dartmouth College, don't join the book burners in June of 1953. Don't be afraid to go into the library and take out any book. That's the spirit we should be in today, the spirit of Ike. So don't be like the fascists and Nazis and the communists like Stalin who want to destroy books. Be like Ike. Don't join the book burners.
I've heard that before. Be like Ike. Hey, I appreciate the story that you told at the end, only I fear that you've now given ideas to people who are for the banning of books that, well, maybe they should add Robin Hood to the list as well. Kenneth, thank you. That was excellent as always. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's such an important issue, and I appreciate being able to address it.
Thank you. Kenneth Davis is the best-selling author of Don't Know Much About History and other books in the Don't Know Much About series. He wrote the acclaimed In the Shadow of Liberty and now Strong Man.